So again, welcome to the second installment in the series of events in commemoration of Africa Month and the 20th anniversary of the formation of the African Union, hosted by the University of Cape Town through the Faculty of Humanities, alongside the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. I am Professor Erwani Ramugondo, the incoming Deputy Vice Chancellor for Transformation, Student Affairs, and Social Responsiveness. It is a real privilege to welcome you all today. Last night I had the great honor of introducing Minister for International Relations and Cooperation, Dr. Grace Naledi Pandor, as our keynote speaker, which she started off by sharing with us her aspirations to serve in the academy, to serve for much longer than her leadership in politics would permit. It was heartwarming to note that she takes great joy in seeing part of her dreams fulfilled through some of us. But Minister, one thing I would like to say is that God willing, many of us would be forced into retirement before you. 65, unfortunately, is the cutoff age in the academy. So I think the EFF probably needs to get used to seeing you around for much longer. A special welcome to you again. I also extend my special welcome to all other respected government representatives, high commissioners, ambassadors, and consul generals, to my esteemed colleagues in the higher education sector, and to everyone who has joined us in person, but also those who are joining us through live stream. Last night, we received an outstanding public lecture from Minister Pandor, leaving us plenty of food for thought. One challenge the minister posed for us is to interrogate with honesty why it is that as a continent, we continue to face the disjuncture between lofty plans and action. For our proceedings tonight, our Honorable Minister will start us off presenting a keynote address on Pan-Africanism in current times. The topic itself gives us a clue that Pan-Africanism, as both an idea of philosophy and practice, might have evolved with time. When Kwame Nkrumah coined the term Pan-Africanism in the 1960s, during his term as the first president of an independent post-colonial Ghana, the idea of a united Africa was spreading across our continent as it shared its colonial masters, one country at a time. Like Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Leopold Sedar Senghor, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Jomo Kenyatta, Patrice Lumumba, and Haile Selassie were at the forefront of cementing the idea that the borders drawn by imperial powers were ill-fitted to the continent's realities. But the Pan-Africanist ideal involved shedding not only geographical boundaries, but social and economic divisions that were seen as impediments to the people of Africa's emancipation from poverty and marginalization from matters of global importance. There is logic to this united approach, as it is the best chance available for the continent to prosper, and for all its people to live in peace and to realize their full capabilities as humans. Minister Pandor mentioned yesterday, however, that one of the main obstacles to integration and collaboration on the continent is that sovereignty is used by some as a defense mechanism, instead of being used as a means to pull our strength and to mitigate each other's weaknesses as kin in the global south. It does not help as well that interference in sovereign political affairs by former colonial powers who find it hard to let go of their empires and global economic systems cajole countries into adopting back to the wall me-first monetary policies that are fundamentally at odds with the notion of everyone working together and for each other. Against this backdrop, it is encouraging, however, that we are taking some concrete steps towards unity. The African Continental Free Trade Area being one prime example. So what does Pan-Africanism look like today? As a continent, what should we be aiming for? What is to be said about the prominence of male figures as interlocutors for how we often reimagine Pan-Africanism? Notwithstanding that Africa cannot rewrite its history of mostly male post-colonial leaders, what of those mothers of Pan-Africanism from the diaspora, like Audley Moore and Dara Abubakari, or others born on this continent whose names may have never been documented or elevated? Minister Pandor's keynote address on this topic is sure to provide much to ponder. The keynote address will lead us into a panel discussion, after which we all have a substantive, we will have a substantive question and answer session for as long as time will allow. And our panel tonight, I must say, is filled with stars from the academic arena. They will be fully introduced in time, but for now it is sufficient that we know who they are. So I will ask that they briefly take off their mask and wave when I call their names. Starting with Associate Professor Shosekesi, Dean of Humanities, Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at UCT. There she is. Professor Bekim Gomezulu. There you are. Professor Bekim Gomezulu is from the Political Science Department at the University of the Western Cape. Advocate Vasu Gauden. Gauden. I mean, it's quite interesting that we spoke so much about pronunciation, and here I'm faltering, yet I was perfect. Thank you. Advocate Gauden, he's founder and executive director of the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, or ACCORD. Then we have Olirato, right? That's the right tonation. Olirato Mokhomotsi. Olirato is a philosophy lecturer at UCT. And we have Dr. Tuto Tipe. Dr. Tipe is from the Center for African Studies at UCT, and she will be moderating our discussion soon after I conclude this part. Soon after the keynote. I really can't wait to get our proceedings started. I hope you are as excited as I am. So please join me as I welcome Minister Pandor to the podium.
Very much, Deputy Vice Chancellor and Program Director. Good evening, everyone. Dumelang molweni. Assalamu alaikum. Well, I'm quite surprised to see the number given the rain and the mist. But thank you all for coming out this evening. I hope I won't bore you terribly. I thought we had a good evening yesterday, but I'm really looking forward to the panel. I think the panel is far cleverer than I am, and there are some really bright contributors. So I look forward to the opportunity to listen to all of them. So let me begin then and thank the Deputy Vice Chancellor again for the kind welcome and introduction, and recognize the senior officials from my department, as well as senior leadership within the University of Cape Town and the University of the Western Cape. We had hoped to be at the Western Cape. We wanted to be fair to our institutions in the province, but I got COVID, so we had to cancel. And then when we tried to reset, we couldn't quite get the dates right. But thank you very much for being here. And of course, the distinguished students, ladies and gentlemen. Once more, I'm really honored to be given an opportunity to make a contribution as part of our celebration of the birth of our continental organization, the African Union, the successor organization to the OAU. We're celebrating 20 years of the African Union this year. And of course, as we think about it, we must also think of the philosophical underpinnings of our African thought, and particularly look at that philosophy that influenced African political ideology, Pan-Africanism. I cannot overemphasize the relevance of this theme to this seminar and to the whole idea of the renewal of Africa. So essentially what we're trying to talk about is Pan-Africanism in the current times. I really look forward to the panel discussion on the theme and also on ideas on how this philosophy can be sustained and whether it should be sustained in contemporary times, and how we might take it forward and bequeath it as an ideal to future generations. Pan-Africanism was born out of an intellectual contestation of ideas by Africans, both on the continent as well as in the diaspora during the early parts of the 18th and 19th century. These contested ideas evolved from reflections about racism, about empowerment, and then became somewhat of a global movement from a very narrow consideration about the effects of racism and how a community or society might respond. It grew into a philosophy of global influence. As you would all know, it was initially a response to the evil of slavery, to imperialism and its effects, to colonialism and racism. All of these having been visited upon Africans and African people, descendants of Africa who were in the diaspora, not of their own will, and found themselves in very negative conditions. The development of intellectual thought on Pan-Africanism began really to circulate in that late 18th century, early 19th century period, particularly in the United States, led by thinkers such as Marin Delaney, Alexander Crummell, and Edward Blyden. They all held the view that Black people could not prosper and would not prosper alongside whites who had previously oppressed them. And so they advocated the idea that Africans should separate themselves from the United States and establish their own state in Africa. You'll recall that Back to Africa movement of the early negritude ideas. In the early 20th century, these ideas were embraced and further developed by intellectual thinkers such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Garvey championed the cause of African independence with an emphasis on the attributes of Black people's collective past. In fact, when you read the writings of Garvey, you have this assertion of Africanness as a constant and a reflection back to Africa as an important resource for Black people. But eventually there began to be almost a negative response to Garvey because of that back to Africa notion, because those Africans that had been settled in America felt they should make their place in the space in which they found themselves and regarded it as not a executable notion, the idea that you go back to Africa and establish yourself as a state that would then ensure the empowerment and the advancement of previously enslaved persons of African descent. Du Bois was credited as the true father of modern Pan-Africanism, to the extent that to a great degree his name became synonymous with this philosophy and this movement. He spent a great deal of his life studying on the continent. And some will recall his famous speech, The Problem of the Color Line in the 20th century, which set out his thinking on these matters. I was more influenced by W.E.B. Du Bois' essay on the talented 10th, which really speaks to you, university students and academics, and the expectation that the African intelligentsia had about the role that educated Africans would play in advancing the status and development of African people. But of course, all of us know the issue of the color line, and this being the key problem to be resolved in the 20th century. And you remember The Soul of Black Folks, which was an extensive account of the condition of Black people in slavery in America and the Caribbean, and the condition in which they found themselves once they became free of slavery. Also devoted a great deal of attention in this set of articles on the challenging legacy of racism. He recognized, and this is what is really for me intriguing about Du Bois, that there wouldn't be an overnight change to the condition of Black people, that it would take many decades of a great deal of hard work, of redressing self-consciousness, of addressing attributes, of really focused education. Over time, you then would have a change, but it wouldn't be an immediate. And the notion that after oppression and racist colonialism, you are immediately able to change your condition upon achieving freedom is a notion that was challenged by W.E.B. Du Bois and dealt with in huge detail. He served as an academic at Fisk University and later, at Wilberforce and Atlanta University, where he ended up lecturing. As a thinker who understood the importance of transforming theory into practice, Du Bois was one of the organizers of the first Pan-Africanist conference that took place in Paris in 1919. And it was followed by a second Congress in 1921, just 2 years later, which was a very celebratory Pan-African conference because it was post the end of the First World War, and there was huge anticipation with the Versailles Treaty that something would change fundamentally in the world. The conference grew from a Paris setting in 1919 to a 3-city set of sessions 2 years later in London, Brussels, and Paris. He believed very much in Black action to address the residue of racism and believed the educated African could play a critical role. Amongst the participants in these conferences were African students studying in Europe at the time. And the deliberations had a profound impact on their own political consciousness about Africa. Most of them eventually became leaders of liberation movements in their own countries on their return to the African continent. Amongst the earliest proponents of Pan-Africanism from our own continent were prominent South Africans, Charlotte Mahomo Maxeke. I'm glad that I have a woman to mention, Deputy Vice Chancellor, and Dr. Pixley Isaka Seme. Seme was also one of the founding fathers of the African National Congress. Both he and Me Maxeke spent time studying in the United States of America. And during their time there, as very young and impressionable students open to new ideas, they became among the first Africans from Southern Africa to interact with the intellectual movement of Pan-Africanism. As a student at Wilberforce University, at the time when Du Bois taught there, Maxeke could not escape the infectious pull of Pan-Africanist ideals that were shared by Du Bois, who became her mentor and teacher. And she brought much of his ideas back to South Africa. You would recall that with the establishment of Wilberforce University, Du Bois and others working with him had been thinking about how do we create institutions that offer real opportunity for skills and education to Black students. And in the end, they said we must establish our own institutions. But the interesting, perhaps negative or difficulty, was that much of their thought about the institution was how you train young people to earn a livelihood, rather than the highest ranks of intellectual endeavor. And so it was very vocationally and technically focused education. Nevertheless, those institutions made an important contribution to the education of young Black Americans at that time. This notion that we can run our own educational establishments that will create a different kind of personality is, of course, a debate we have here in South Africa. And I don't know if we have succeeded. I think one of the better successes for me is UWC. And I'm not saying that because you're here, Professor Gomezulu, it's because I do know that UWC doesn't have a problem with the notions of excellence or quality, when sometimes we see them as counterposed to empowerment. And I think Du Bois and their ilk thought in that way about institutions they sought to create. So 700 kilometers away from Wilberforce University, at the very senior halls of Columbia University in New York, a very different institution from Wilberforce, a 25-year-old South African student, Pixley Isaka Seme, delivered what was considered a seminal speech entitled The Regeneration of Africa. The speech was so impressive that he won an oratory award for it, the Curtis Medal, from the University of Columbia. In essence, the philosophy he spoke about, the regeneration, promoted a belief in self, in Africanness, and put forward the view that Africans need to take charge of their destiny. He also called in the lecture for African institutions learning using African curricula in focus and taught by learned Africans. We had the mic in a different position yesterday, much easier to manage, because I like to move my hands. Sorry, I'm sorry. So it was in this speech that Pixley Kaseme articulated the ideas of Pan-Africanism, repeating the influences that he had gained from academics such as Du Bois. It's also vital to mention that his speech apparently inspired African revolutionaries such as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. I know this because in December 1962, at the first International Congress of Africanists in Accra, Ghana, Nkrumah quoted Seme's oratory lecture in its entirety, not a paragraph, the whole lecture. Chief Albert Luthuli also spoke on some of these matters. He said the following when receiving the Nobel Prize Award in 1961 in Oslo, Norway. This award could not be for me alone, nor just for South Africa, but for Africa as a whole. Africa presently is most deeply torn with strife and most bitterly stricken with racial conflict. How strange then it is that a man of Africa should be here to receive an award given for service to the cause of peace and brotherhood between men. There has been little peace in Africa in our time. From the northernmost end of our continent, where war has raged for 7 years, to the center and to the south, there are battles being fought out, some with arms, some without. Our continent has been carved up by the great powers. Alien governments have been forced upon the African people by military conquest and by economic domination. Strivings for nationhood and national dignity have been beaten down by force. Traditional economics and ancient customs have been disrupted, and human skills and energy have been harnessed for the advantage of our conquerors. In these times, there has been no peace. There could be no brotherhood between men. You may wonder why my remarks are focused on this history. It's because I would like you to extract from what I'm saying attributes that came to make up the thought of Pan-Africanism. And each of these speakers are reflecting their thought on that. 90 years later, 90 years after Seme spoke at Columbia University, the opening lines of his speech, I am an African, and I set my pride in my race over against the hostile public opinion. 90 years later, they were echoed by then President Thabo Mbeki, Deputy President Thabo Mbeki, during the occasion of the adoption of our new South African Constitution in our parliament, right here in Cape Town. I wonder which of what we say 90 years later will be used by others. It's quite incredible. The same ideals underpinned the African Renaissance philosophy, which was later adopted as central to South Africa's foreign policy towards the African continent. Working toward the Renaissance of the continent continues to be the lodestar of our own diplomatic activities on the continent. The intellectual influence that the founding fathers of Pan-Africanism had on South African students was so profound that they later sought to transform these ideas from theory into practice. And you'll find these underpinnings in many, many sectors that you might pay attention to. For example, look at the last statement of the outgoing rector of Fort Hare University when the Extension of University Education Act was passed, and how he laments the effect of apartheid education on their intentions in establishing a Fort Hare, where all students of all colors could come together and study, led by competent academics and intellectuals. This notion that we can do things better and for ourselves. When these Africans who were influenced overseas completed their studies abroad, they came back and fought the horrendous injustice of the apartheid system, which sought to treat Black people as foreigners in their own land. Seme, of course, became one of the first conveners of the famous conference that founded the ANC in Mangaung in 1912. And as I've said previously, some of you might be aware that Charlotte Maxeke was the only woman at that founding conference. And the conference spent over 2 hours debating whether a woman should be allowed to stay at that founding conference. And it was people like Seme knew Maxeke who in fact argued that she had a right to be present. And eventually the decision was she could be there as part of the founding members of that conference in 1912. Very interesting on how women were observed. So of course, we have a strong African nationalism which informed the initial formation of the ANC in 1912. But you also know that that strong nationalism was later transformed toward a national movement which developed a broader identity and membership. And that's what led to the schism between the ANC and the emerging Pan-Africanist Congress. So with the end of apartheid in South Africa, we've had a new energy and new ideals of Pan-Africanism, both theoretical as well as practical. The new government articulated a new vision for Africa, informed by the notion of an impending African Renaissance. The OAU and then the AU portrayed the organization, and still does, as a Pan-African one, ready to fulfill the continent's destiny using all available means. It is this resolve that has found expression in the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which states, "We are inspired by the noble ideals which guided the founding fathers of our continental organization and generations of Pan-Africanists in their determination to promote unity, solidarity, cohesion, and cooperation among the peoples of Africa and African states." I think that's one of the nicest, crisp definitions that I could find of what this might mean for us. So Pan-Africanism, defined here in our Act of the AU, meant integrated efforts to advance the development of our continent. I was reading a series of articles in a lovely book on Africa by the Mapungubwe Institute, and it makes a great deal in the various chapters of this notion of integration as being the core of what Pan-Africanists would like to see achieved by our continent. Kwame Nkrumah, speaking at the launch of the OAU in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1963, said the following: "The resources are there. It is for us to marshal them in the active service of our people. Unless we do this by our concerted efforts within the framework of our combined planning, we shall not progress at the tempo demanded by today's events and the mood of our people. The symptoms of our troubles will grow, and the troubles themselves become chronic. It will then be too late, even for Pan-African unity, to secure for us stability and tranquility in our labors for a continent of social justice and material well-being. Unless, that is 1963, we establish African unity now, we who are sitting here today shall tomorrow be the victims and martyrs of neocolonialism. And this wonderful collection of the Mapungubwe Institute says part of our problem at being unable to generate benefit out of the ideals of what one of the authors calls communitarianism rather than Pan-Africanism. Part of the problem is the nexus between our ideals and the clash with the practices of neocolonialism. And this is really what is causing the trouble that we face. Just 5 years before the launch of the Organization of African Unity, George Mills Hauser wrote in his report on the outcome of the All African Peoples Conference held in December 1958 in Accra, Ghana. A genuine Pan-Africanism was given expression throughout the conference. A new important dimension has been added. Whereas until recently, Pan-Africanism has always been a racial concept, Africa for Africans, meaning Black Africans, now a residential element has been added. Anyone living in Africa, white or Black, could be part of the Africa of the future, so long as the basic principle of democracy, one man, one vote, is accepted. How simply put then? How complex today? There's no question, in conclusion, that the South African struggle was inspired by the ideals of Pan-Africanism, and that philosophy heavily influenced the liberation movements in our country. Pan-Africanism as a philosophy found expression in what the ANC believed. And our former President Nelson Mandela espoused the vision of Pan-Africanism in a number of speeches and talks he gave. Our first democratic government was, I think, quick and seminal in adopting the symbolic Nkosi Sikelel' iAfrika, God bless Africa, as our national anthem. So our anthem is not about South Africa, it's about the continent. Today, we have a foreign policy which is also inspired by the ideals and values of Pan-Africanism. And what we are now working at is the challenge of ensuring that these ideals are translated into tangible action so that all of Africa's people enjoy a better life and a prosperous future. So in conclusion, I believe that the ideals of Pan-Africanism continue to be important and that we need to embrace them as part of the armor and tools that we utilize as we seek to fundamentally alter the future destiny of our continent. And I hope it is young people who will take up these ideals. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Minister, for that profound keynote, a historical overview of Pan-Africanism, highlighting key milestones, key figures, some contradictions, tensions, and contextual factors the movement was responding to. To students and academics who are here, I'm sure you have the basis upon which you can evaluate your own course content, whatever discipline. You've heard firsthand, and it is our wish, Minister, that this address is published and can continue to be a resource, an inspiration, and content that perhaps 90 years from now on, we can continue to draw on. I now have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for our panel session, Dr. Tuto Tipe, who is a historian of 19th and 20th century Southern Africa, and as I said before, a lecturer in African Studies at the University of Cape Town. Dr. Tipe earned her doctorate from Yale University in History and Africa American Studies in 2020, and is currently working on a book manuscript, Black Freehold, Land Ownership in Alexandra Township. This is based on her award-winning PhD thesis. Tuto's work examines the relationship between property rights, race, and state formation through legal and social history. She also holds degrees in history, gender studies, and political science from the University of Cape Town and Macalester College. She previously worked in the UCT Law Faculty's Center for Law and Society as a researcher, and has published in a range of local and international platforms, including New York Law Review, Harvard Human Rights Journal Online Symposium, South African Journal of Human Rights, and Oxford University Press Handbook on South Africa. And I must say, I've had the pleasure of supervising a PhD student with Dr. Tipe, a real treat. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, Deputy Vice Chancellor. Sorry, I'm already calling you DVC, yes, DVC. And thank you very much, Honorable Minister Dr. Pandor, for that rich, rigorous, and stimulating contemplation on the philosophical development and interpretation of Pan-Africanism. It's embraced by different groups of intellectual leaders on the continent and the diaspora, and its implementation, the making real of these ideas across the past 300 years, here at home and abroad. I echo the idea that I look forward to citing this myself and to the next 90 years of scholars citing your thinking. Thank you very much. Now we will turn our attention to our esteemed panel as we continue our engagements on the thought of Pan-Africanism. We have our first panelist, Professor Peggy Gomezulu, who comes from Ingwavuma in far northern KwaZulu-Natal. He teaches Africa in international perspective and international relations theory. He has 7 academic degrees in politics, history, and education, a senior secondary teacher's diploma, and a PhD in African political history from Rice University in the United States. To date, Professor Gomezulu has published 4 books, 6 book chapters, 12 book reviews, and several articles in national and international journals. He has presented over 90 academic papers nationally and internationally. He is a professor of political science at the University of the Western Cape and the president of the Economic History Society of Southern Africa. He belongs to many other academic bodies and also serves in the Nelson Mandela Museum Council. His research interests include international relations, African comparative politics, governance, higher education, and traditional leadership. Our second panelist this evening will be Dr. Vasu Gounden. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Apologies if I'm not.
You know after I pronounce your name.
Okay. That's fair. He is the founder and executive director of the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, founded in 1992. This body is today a globally recognized conflict management institution and has been rated by Pennsylvania University's annual think tank rating in the top 100 think tanks globally for 11 consecutive years. In 2018, Vasu founded Global Peace to mobilize a global constituency to strengthen multilateralism and to build a better world. Vasu was a Fulbright scholar at Georgetown University, where he graduated with an LLM and is admitted to the High Court of South Africa as an advocate. Over the last 30 years, Vasu has been involved in preparing conflicting parties across Africa for political negotiations and has supported the facilitators in peace processes in, among many others, Burundi, the DRC, Madagascar, Sudan, South Sudan, and Somalia. He is currently involved in the Sudan peace process. Vasu has served on several commissions in South Africa and serves on the boards of several institutions across the world, including the advisory board of Cyber Peace Institute. He has addressed the United Nations Security Council on several occasions on matters relating to conflict management and has been elected by the World Economic Forum as one of their global leaders for tomorrow. Our third panelist for the evening is Olerato Mokhomodzi. Olerato is a philosophy lecturer at the University of Cape Town and a doctoral fellow at HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa. His research focuses on social ontology, focusing on providing a conceptual analysis of social identities, the nature of social belonging, and how this can help us understand the phenomenological ontology of the modern African subject. He holds a Master of Social Science in Philosophy from UCT, an MPhil in African Studies from the University of Cambridge. Olerato is currently completing his PhD in philosophy at UCT and is an inaugural fellow of the Accelerated Transformation in Academia program, an initiative to transform academia under the DVC of Transformation Office at UCT. In the past, Olerato has held the Philomanthia Graduate Fellowship, the Mandela Rhodes Fellowship, and the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship, and is an Alan Gray Orbis Fellow. And our fourth esteemed panelist, Shose Kesi, is Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Cape Town, Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology, and co-director of the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies in Africa. Her research centers on political philosophy, community-based empowerment, and social change. A key focus in her work is the development of photo voice methodology as a participatory action research tool that can raise consciousness and mobilize community groups into social action. She has published on the psychology of racism in higher education and recently co-authored a book titled Psychology and Pan-Africanism in Decolonial Times. Shose completed her PhD in 2010 in organizational social psychology at the London School of Economics and Political Science and joined UCT in 2011. She is one of the founding members and the first chairperson of the UCT Black Academic Caucus. We are in for a real treat this evening. Each of our panelists will speak for 5 minutes, up to 7 minutes. I'll cut off at 7 minutes. And this is because we have scheduled load shedding at 8 p.m. So we need to get out before the lights go out. So before I take any more time, I invite the panelists to please join us on stage. Prof. Gomezulu, will you please launch us for this evening?
Thank you very much, Program Director. And good evening, Minister Pandor, the senior management from UCT, ladies and gentlemen. Minister, let me start off by saying two things. I'm notorious for a lot of things, and one of them is to keep politicians and judges on their toes. If you ask Justice Zondo, he will have a thing or two to say. And then I woke up at 5 a.m. today and I had something to say with on Judge Kuhn and his statements. But I promise today I'll be a good boy. I'll be well behaved. There are a lot of things that one would have wanted to say, but in the interest of time, I'll cut to the chase. Perhaps I should pick up on the points that were made by the minister. That is one of the things that we are failing to do as intelligentsia is to Africanize the curriculum at our institutions. I've tried doing this at UWC and I earned myself my notoriety. And I received 7 anonymous letters from some people who had more time and didn't know what to do with it. And they decided to write me letters without any signature. I'm still working on that. But the more the letters came, the more I became vocal on the issues. So I'll just go straight to the points here, and I'll skip the parts that the minister has already attended to. That is the history behind the formation of Pan-Africanism and the key role players who participated in this at its early stages. I'll skip all of those. And I'll also skip some of the notes I had picked up from some of the writings I've put forth, especially the one wherein I was assessing Pan-Africanism, and then, of course, the Pan-African Parliament, looking at how it has failed us in many ways, more especially because some of our African leaders think that they live in France, and they even say that we should remove the headquarters from Johannesburg and take the headquarters to France, which was a shame. You might have seen that in the news, but I'm not politicking, I'm just stating facts. Oh, okay, and then I'll skip the part on the genesis, as I said, because the minister has done a sterling job on that. I'll go straight to some of the key questions. One is, why was Pan-Africanism conceived in the first place? First of all, Pan-Africanism was triggered by suffering of Africans who were residing both in Africa and those in the diaspora, and that is the point the minister has already mentioned. And the aims were quite many, but I'll just confine myself to a few. One, it was to unite African nations as well as Africans in the African diaspora. And then the second one was to instill collaboration and brotherhood amongst Africans and people of African descent, regardless of wherever they resided. And the third one was to minimize the impact of white oppression on African people. It was anti-racism and anti-discrimination. And then the next one was to demonstrate that Africans have power only if they work together. That's why we say together we win and then divided we fall. And then the last one was to envision the future of African people devoid of dependency on whites, which is unfortunately something that we still are still struggling with. Now, what are the strategies that have been used to sustain Pan-Africanism? Because the focus of today's discussion is on Pan-Africanism in current times. So some of the strategies include the following. One, establishing vibrant regional blocs such as the East African Community, SADC, ECOWAS, and ECAS, that is Economic Commission of Central African States. The next one is establishing a continental body, that is the AU, which comes from the OAU, of course, whose aim was basically to serve as an institutional framework to realize Pan-Africanism's goal and giving a mandate and a clear focus to the African leadership. And the third one is operationalizing the African Continental Free Trade Area, because it was there as a thought, but now we've started operationalizing. So that is one of the things that we've done as a continent. And then anticipating and intervening in problematic situations, like we've seen this happening in Mozambique, DRC, Sudan, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Eswatini, and the list goes on. Whether we've succeeded or not, then there's a debate for another day. Strengthening diplomatic ties and, of course, relations among African countries in order to share resources, and then sharing information on various issues of common interest, with the view to uplift the African continent. Now, what are some of the impediments to us actualizing and, of course, ensuring that Pan-Africanism becomes a reality? I'll just highlight a few. One, compartmentalization of the African continent into Anglophone Africa, Francophone Africa, and Lusophone Africa. This is a serious problem because we African leaders meet in Addis Ababa, but then immediately after the meeting, some of our erstwhile colonizers find a way of infiltrating the AU, and then they persuade some of our leaders to do something opposite to what was agreed to. So this compartmentalization of Africa, therefore, is an impediment towards the actualization of the Pan-Africanism agenda. The second one is linguistic barriers. It's a shame that the AU for quite some time had to work with foreign languages. Only now that Kiswahili is being introduced as one of the languages used by the AU. This one is a shame to the African leadership, but at least we're waking up. And then the next one is weak economies. There is an irony. We say Africa is rich, but then it is poor. And then we have had a number of stories in that regard. So there is something wrong that we are doing, and then we should do things differently. So that becomes one of the challenges. Then the other one is intra and interstate intermittent clashes. In East Africa, this is based on ethnicity, and in other areas, it's both ethnicity and religion, as you might have seen in countries like Nigeria, for instance, and then in other parts of the continent. Then the other one is acceptability of African leaders to be pitted against their own leaders. We have African leaders that are turned against their fellow African leaders by the West. So that means that both exogenous and endogenous causal factors are at the core of the reason why we're unable to fulfill our goal of Pan-Africanism. And then failure to implement policies already agreed to. We come up with clear policies. Africa is generous when it comes to formulating policies, but implementation is a problem. I don't know whether monitoring and evaluation is at play. If not, then it means something needs to be done. What is the way forward? One, African leaders should strive to implement policies and protocols already agreed to. Secondly, the idea of African solutions to African problems should be made real. It shouldn't be just political rhetoric. There must be something tangible done in that regard. African institutions like the Pan-African Parliament have to be strengthened and have teeth so that if you have leaders that are misbehaving, we have a way of dealing with them and calling them to order. Africans should refrain from praising their erstwhile colonizers at the expense of their leaders. And then the last but one is meritocracy. Let us elect people who are going to and appoint people who are going to exercise what is supposed to be exercised, not because they are our friends or because we fear them. Meritocracy has assisted a country like Singapore to move from being a third world country to being a first world country. And then if we do that, we'll achieve our goal. And then African leaders should desist from clinging on to power indefinitely. I wrote a book called The President for Life Pandemic in Africa, where I was questioning this particular issue. And then Pan-Africanism is still relevant in current times. All that is needed is astute leadership and visionary leadership. Our forebears had a vision. Ours is to fulfill it. Thank you, Chair.
Our second panelist is Dr. Gounden.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thipe. Is that correct? Moderator, DVC, Professor Ramagondo, and Minister Naledi Pandor, distinguished friends, panelists. The main thread of my discussion is that Pan-Africanism is not merely about our attributes, but it's about our attitudes. And let me start with an anecdote. You see, Minister, I've removed my tie because I went to address a gathering of African diplomats in Pretoria. And when I got there, much to my discontent, I was the only one without a tie. All the ambassadors had their ties on. So I had to think very fast. And I said, ambassadors, let me tell you an anecdote. I once pitched up in Brighton outside London. And for those of you who have been there, you know, and it's cold, there's the howling wind. And then you realize why the British put on ties, they have to cover their necks. I said on another occasion, I stepped off the plane in Ghana and I felt the heat go through my pants and I realized why the Ghanaians wear the flowing gowns. Now, I said ambassadors, you know, it's very hot here in Pretoria, and I'm not sure why you have your ties. And the only conclusion I can come to is that you would like to celebrate your colonial legacy. And you should see how fast they started taking their ties off. So you don't have to take your tie out. So to speak of Pan-Africanism in current times, we must first be clear about what was Pan-Africanism in the past times. We should be asking ourselves, what is that united the African political leadership in the past that made future and present generations to regard them as Pan-Africanists? The Pan-Africanism of yesteryear was about the total political liberation of the continent. Rightly or wrongly, that generation of Africans united behind the idea of seek here the political kingdom and all else will follow. As we know today, not all else is followed. And that was their generational mission to deliver the continent from colonialism, imperialism, and even apartheid. If we agree on this achievement, then we need to ask ourselves, what is the mission of Pan-Africanists and the place of Pan-Africanism in our current times? A simple answer to this question may be found in the following words by that great revolutionary, Amilcar Cabral. Always remember that the people are not fighting for ideas, nor for what it is in men's minds. The people fight and accept the sacrifices demanded by the struggles in order to gain material advantages, to live better and in peace, to benefit from progress, and for the better future of their children. National liberation, the struggle against colonialism, the construction of peace, progress, and independence are hollow words, devoid of any significance unless they can be translated into a real improvement of living conditions. These simple words describe the African condition today, and one which calls for serious strategic reflection, some of which we have had now from the professor, and collective action from within the continent in order to effectively address our challenges. A majority of the African people live in poverty in spite of the abundance of natural resources. The majority of young people in Africa are without jobs, in spite of the myriad of statistics produced about youth unemployment and numerous policies being put in place, which are said to address issues of employment for young people. This challenge, however, still persists and is growing. So if we look at the 60s, what was it about? Liberation from colonialism, imperialism, and apartheid. And what was it that united our leaders? They were united by a common purpose. They were schooled in the same fraternal universities, Fort Hare, Makerere University, etc. They trained militarily together. They fought alongside each other, and they sacrificed for each other. And this is what created that Pan-African bond that we talk about today. If we look at the 70s and 80s, and many of us were influenced by the writings and teachings of Steve Biko and his philosophy of Black consciousness. I write what I think, the liberation of our minds, an important development. There is no greater liberation than the liberation of the mind. Still a period of solidarity across the world, united by a common cause, the end of the struggles of all peoples, but still subjugated under colonialism. I write what I think. In the 90s, the end of the Cold War, the end of apartheid, the end of one-party state, the birth of multi-party democracy, but we know that what it brought with it was competitive politics, something we were not completely ready for, and that brought a myriad of conflicts on the continent. The OAU had to adapt very fast to this new environment, and we were lucky to have a front row seat in 1993 as a court when the OAU began to look at conflicts on the continent and developed preventive and management mechanisms to deal with the conflicts. In the 2000s, that vision came together in what Minister talked about today, an integrated approach to Africa's challenges. We had APSA, the African Peace Support Architecture for Peace and Security, the peer review mechanism for governance, the AUDA and NEPAD for development, and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement for trade. Now, on the 20th anniversary, we face new challenges and new opportunities. COVID-19, despite all the doomsday predictions, had its health and economic impact, but it also forged a new Pan-African unity and has now led to innovative initiatives on pharmacy and production of vaccines, etc. The war in Ukraine will also present us with new challenges. We will once again be asked to choose sides as we are being asked today, and all our progress risks being undone because, as Julius Nyerere said, we can only survive if we are united as a continent. But there will be new opportunities coming out of this crisis. We can rise up to the challenge of developing our energy resources on the continent and becoming a net exporter of energy. We can use the 60% of the world's agricultural land that sits here on the continent to feed our own people and a large part of the world. Our coltan, our copper, platinum, palladium, and nickel can drive battery technology and clean energy for electric vehicles. And our 1 billion young people can become the factory of the world. So we have the structures, we have the resources, we have the people. All that is left for us is to liberate our minds. We need, like Black consciousness, what I called at one of our AU meetings, a new African consciousness, rooted in our Pan-African history. Pan-Africanism is not about attributes, it's about attitudes. And let me end with one anecdote that will very poignantly indicate why I talk about attributes and attitudes. The former premier of KZN, now High Commissioner in India, Sbu Ndebele, started a African Renaissance movement, and annually used to bring a number of African Americans led by Reverend Orange. And on one occasion, we had a group of Burundians that we were training in Durban. I called the then premier and said, Premier, I have a group of Burundian colleagues. Can I bring them to the conference? And he said, yeah, please bring them. And he said, Vasu, why don't you bring them earlier to the VIP room so they can meet the VIPs, Reverend Orange? And so I took them there, and I was introducing the Cabinet Secretary of Burundi to Reverend Orange. And I said, you know, this is the Cabinet Secretary of Burundi. And he said, hey, man, where's Burundi? And so I was so embarrassed. You know, I said, sorry, Reverend, you know, it's you know, Rwanda. It's, oh, yeah, the place where they butchered all those people. Yeah, now I know. It's not about the attributes. It's about the attitude. So even though they came for the African Renaissance Conference, the homecoming, it was about the attitudes that should be what shapes our Pan-Africanism. So let us not, as Minister said, become the victims or the martyrs of neocolonialism. Thank you.
Thank you. And now to our Olerad.
Dumelang. Ke rata go dumedisa Dr. Naledi Pandor, DVC of Transformation Incoming, Professor Ramugundo, Dean of Humanities, Associate Professor Shose Kesi, distinguished speakers, and fellow Africanists. I would like to begin by obviously expressing my gratitude for being here on this great panel. I want to say that I'm a South African. More particularly, I'm a South African African. My South African Africanness is not coincidental, but a product of intention and very particular circumstances. Growing up in Mabopane, a predominantly Tswana township in Tshwane, Gauteng, I would not come to know the full extent of Pan-Africanism until much later in my life, and it's not that long, when I joined multicultural and transnational spaces where a commitment to Pan-Africanism was either already institutionalized or attracted individuals committed to Pan-Africanism. A few weeks back, I got to sit with a friend of mine from Cameroon, married to a woman from Zambia, with other friends from Cote d'Ivoire that I met in the diaspora as I studied overseas, as we shared in a meal of very spicy mackerel, fried plantain, and the very, special pepper sauce, the Cameroonian pepper sauce. From many experiences like these, my life would come to embody a wholesome commitment to the Pan-Africanist ideal. In South Africa, experiences like mine make up a locus of experiences which I can only hope will be shared by others all over the country. Instead, the relation between South Africans and other Africans is marked by a very dire and reprehensible xenophobia endemic. Provocations, rather, in response to our situation are many. We speak of a politics of hatred, of fear, the loss of Ubuntu, exclusionary politics, and nationalism to account for the situation we find ourselves in today. For tonight, I offer the following provocation. What may be going wrong, perhaps that we're missing on a fundamental and perhaps philosophical level, with the journey towards the attainment of African unity, threatening to reduce the realization of Pan-Africanism to a mere fiction in South Africa. Political theorist Julius Nyerere observed that nationalism poses the danger of being counterproductive to Pan-Africanism, as there is an inclination to work first for the prosperity of one's nation before thinking about translating that on a continental level. Perhaps this accounts for the challenges that we are facing today with Pan-Africanism. Perhaps we are witnessing the nationalist curse. Instead of thinking of Pan-Africanism to be at odds with nationalism, perhaps I would like to invite you to start thinking of how Pan-Africanism can have a symbiotic relationship with nationalist interests. Perhaps what we need more of is a nationalist commitment to create conditions ripe for the attainment of the promise of Pan-Africanism. What such a symbiotic relation may amount to certainly involves creating dignified and adequate socioeconomic and political conditions where the nation is nothing to be ungenerous about, but something to be shared willingly and freely. Looking at the proximal barriers to Pan-Africanism, bad social, economic, material conditions in nations will always be a key contributor to what Francis Nyambo refers to as diminishing circles of inclusion that underpin the logic of a politics so hateful and exclusionary as xenophobia. In South Africa, we see a gloomy material reality of record high unemployment, high real inflation, high inequalities, corruption, alarming rates of violent crimes. Under such conditions, people at the peripherals of the socioeconomic structures live in material conditions that produce a lack of dignity and daily bread, such that they see fighting other Africans as part of securing a position at the very top of the lower socioeconomic hierarchy. What we should take note of is that without a commitment to addressing the material impoverishment in the continent's nations, the questions of who gets what, who gets to share in what, and who gets to be a part of what will continue to be driven by motivation to look only at oneself in a state of survivalism. We will see such questions delivering answers contrary to the principles of Ubuntu, Ujamaa, and Teranga that we once held dear to us as Africans. Perhaps waiting for material improvement is to live too much in the clouds of hope, as waiting for a different material reality in South Africa will not stop continuances of a politics of exclusion and violence against other Africans at the present juncture. Being in a state where the pitfalls of national consciousness are clear, we are pressed to answer a question that my African brother and uncle, Divine Far, posed to me. How do we begin to build a humanist and prosperous Africa right now amidst the material lack that defines our nations and most of our continent? To this, I appeal to South Africans to bring into consciousness our very recent history, which we all have a very personal relationship with as Africans from this country. To wholesomely embody a coherent relationship between the lessons of justice delivered by the struggle and our current treatment of others we share with the continent with. Ben Okri stated that those who have had injustices perpetrated on them those who have suffered unbelievable variations of humiliation and brutality, or to have a special light and vision on the nature of justice. So South Africa's own struggle against coloniality and apartheid gives us insight into the necessity of treating other human beings justly and with dignity, the hope for shared prosperity when you have little to nothing, and the importance of unity between Africans in attaining socioeconomic and political freedom. We need not abandon a politics of unity between Africans that once liberated us as Africans of this country. We must instead uphold the same politics with fervor in our relations with other Africans, recognize their humanity in the same way we continually want ours to be recognized. And remember that we are sharing in a destiny and a hope for a prosperous Africa for our Africans.
And our final panelist, Dean Kessie.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge our Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Ramugondo, Minister Pandor. Thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. So as a social psychologist, I have focused my contribution on the value of Pan-Africanism in shaping the resources for identity and belonging for Africans in Africa and the diaspora. And as we heard from the minister's contribution yesterday, Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance are the ideals behind which this, that have shaped current and historical drives for the liberation and integration of Africa in the aftermath and afterlives of colonization. But Pan-Africanism, as the minister also alluded to today, is a contested concept. It's a term that is fraught with disagreements and contradictions, yet it has impacted significantly on the world, both as ideology and action. Its ambiguity, malleability, and existence as an idea and practice flips between disciplinary and historical categories and themes, yet it persists as a term, ideology, and movement through its reappropriation, reassertion, and connection for those of African descent in its ability to mobilize, connect, and provide a sense of mutual identification through the desire for a shared destiny stemming from a historical experience of oppression through slavery and colonization. Pan-Africanism presupposes the need for a collective consciousness of what it means to be African and to reimagine Africa away from its colonial past. It is precisely the contested nature of Pan-Africanism that compels us to think about how relevant it remains in current times by questioning how our identities and sense of belonging become mobilized in calls for Pan-Africanism. Despite the long history of Pan-Africanism, the idea that nations are imagined, constructed artifacts is rarely acknowledged or reflected upon. Rather, people largely represent nationals and non-nationals as naturally different groups of people. This is also institutionalized through state policies and objectified in very tangible national borders that create a physical distinction between us and them, often enforcing essentializing representations of nationhood. Questioning the idea of nation is important for grappling with the contradictions inherent in Pan-African thought. Belonging to the nation is a material but also affective experience that locates us, that shapes our identities and sense of self. We must interrogate why the idea of the nation is presented as an important resource for dignity and pride. It is also one that differentiates us, that instills fear, violence, displacement, impacting on other people's sense of identity and belonging. The ways in which people define their identity and convey a sense of belonging in a particular context depends on their ability to participate in social and political life. This can take many different forms as different contexts are characterized by different cultures of participation. It can, for example, refer to the ability to participate in formal politics, such as voting practices. On the other hand, it can refer to people's engagement in shaping alternative or resistant representations of community and nationality in local contexts, or deconstructing mainstream ideas of the nation through social movements, for example. In other words, one's ability to belong and develop a positive social identity depends on one's ability to participate in imagining the nation. Migrants' legitimacy to participate in the construction of knowledge about the nation depends on the particular political context in terms of both formal immigration laws and policies and popular representations of immigrants and immigration. Research has shown, for example, that elite or Western migrants are more readily recognized as equal and have thus more entitlement to become part of the nation compared to non-elite, non-Western migrants. By being recognized in their social context by dominant others and powerful institutions, they are able to participate in processes of imagining the national community. Belonging somewhere refers to the symbolic power to construct legitimate social knowledge, norms, and identities, as well as to disregard, marginalize, or silence alternative ways of knowing and being. And therefore, belonging and the resources for constructing positive identities is typically afforded to groups of higher social political status who have the power to construct what is real or true. Marginalized groups, on the other hand, can be formally included in the polity and be entitled to full membership rights, but their position within the symbolic life of a nation remains precarious. On this continent, this has included foreign Africans, women, or people of non-conforming gendered and sexual identities, amongst others. Marginalized groups often lack the symbolic power to institute their version of the world over others. As a result, they are forced to accept or live by representations and rules constructed by others. Dominant and essentializing ideas of the nation not only function to create the national group as insiders, they are regulated by customary, legal, and religious principles which function to uphold the contradiction between migrant and citizen, woman and citizen, people of different gendered and sexual identities, and citizen. Thus, the symbolic power to participate in imagining Africa in current times is fundamental to a Pan-African agenda. We need to interrogate who is doing that imagining and for whom. Indeed, the possibility of a Pan-African agenda in the aftermath of independence across the African continent is continually put into question by the reality of ethnic conflicts, xenophobia, genocide, gender-based violence, and the displacement of millions into neighboring countries and Western hemispheres. On a more global scale, through representational and identity processes, people in the global South have also come to be seen as underdeveloped, mediated by stigmatizing images of global poverty. The psychological impact of this contributes to sustaining ideas and aspirations in the superiority and legitimacy of Western knowledge, expertise, and leadership, limiting our reimagining of this continent. The idea of the nation has thus invented and reinvented African identities, often through negative representations of race, gender, and class identities that produce problem people, to quote Du Bois, compelling Africans and African nations to remain divided and compete for dignity and recognition according to dominant neoliberal standards of success in economic, political, and cultural terms, rather than finding unity in common struggles for social change and social justice and redefining these standards. What is called for is a Pan-Africanism that espouses a liberatory framework and an anti-colonial science that theorizes the way power operates through political, structural, and representational modes. We need to draw on the transnational nature of Pan-African feminist work to uncover the ways in which nation states produce and reproduce the political imperatives and histories on which they were founded, along with the consciousness of those who inhabit these spaces. The development of a more critical national consciousness for Pan-Africanist organizing remains imperative in current times. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panel for those thoughtful and engaging reflections that tie together so well with Minister Pandor's historical contextualization. I think we have a bit of an arch here. We have the historical contextualization from experiences of enslavement through to resistances of colonialism, through to early independence and into the present that Minister Pandor put forward. And our panel much more located in the contemporary moment, our contemporary moment, with discussions of initially the university and knowledge production around Africanization of the curriculum. Our first two panelists, I think, speaking really powerfully to the state and the role of the state in bringing together, materially bringing together ideas of Pan-Africanism and cooperation between different parts of the continent, whether it's linguistic divisions, whether it's geographic divisions, and how to overcome these material political divisions. And the second the second half of our panel speaking really beautifully in conversation with each other about the intellectual side of the implications of Pan-Africanism and nationalisms in the way that people relate to each other, conceptualize themselves on the continent, and conceptualize their relationships to each other in different localized contexts. So going from the past into the present, I'd like to pose a question to the panel about the future of Pan-Africanism that you would put forward. Dean Kessie has initiated this with her concluding remarks, but I'm interested from everyone else. You've really rigorously put forward some of the challenges around implementation and around why Pan-Africanism is not realizing some of its potentials that were imagined over the last 300 years. So if you think about the future from where you're sitting and from where you're thinking, what would you put forward for an ideal for Pan-Africanism? In any order, whoever would like to go first.
Okay, let me bell the cat. Basically, for me, the starting point is not necessarily to relegate responsibility to politicians. The moment we do that, that is the relegation of duty. It's a collective effort, because for Pan-Africanism to be a success, it cannot be the responsibility of politicians, nor can it be the responsibility of the intelligentsia or the academy. Because not all academics, by the way, are useful in terms of addressing the issues that face the continent. Some of them have degrees, but they have nothing to show. The same applies to politicians. Not all politicians can address our issues. I was in the Commonwealth conference, and I said something that upset a lot of people. I was saying that some of the politicians are our former students. They could just barely pass, getting 50%, 55%. Then the moment they are members of parliament, they claim we must be honorable members, even if they do nothing honorable. So my short answer will be, for us to have Pan-Africanism, we need collective effort. So all sectors of society should pull to the right, in the right direction, and make sure that we mobilize our resources. That's the only way we can survive. Thanks.
Thanks, bro.
Maybe let me pick up from there to say, I think Prof is correct. You know, it starts not just, we can't relegate this just to the politicians. It's about a national consciousness. And how do you build that national consciousness? Yesterday evening, I had an interesting discussion with the Director General of the Public Service Commission about why are we seeing a deterioration in our public service? And it is about attitude. It is about building a national consciousness. So, you know, when we talk about Pan-Africanism and we talk about building a African consciousness, a Pan-African consciousness, it has to start also with a national consciousness. And there shouldn't be an inherent tension between nationalism and Pan-Africanism, because what it should be about is the pursuing of our national interest through a Pan-African responsibility. And it's understanding what's our national interest and understanding what's our Pan-African responsibility. And then the intersection between the two. So there should not be an inherent tension, but it has to start with our own national individual consciousness also.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Chair. I think what I tried to do in my brief remarks was to really, I think we often talk about Pan-Africanism in a simplistic way, where we're thinking of it in terms of, collaboration and partnership between Africans. But it's very complex. And I think when we think about the nation states and how they were divided along these arbitrary borders, we forget the idea of the nation as an organizing principle for all kinds of things, for the economy, for politics, for social life, everyday social life. And so when we think about the future of Pan-Africanism, I think we really need to think about all these different types of violences that happen as a consequence of that scramble for Africa, whether it's gendered violence, whether it's xenophobia, whether it's around class issues. These are all intertwined in that moment, which was a very violent moment in our history. So I think, yes, this national consciousness needs to be a lot more critical for us to see a future of Pan-Africanism.
Yeah, I just think to piggyback on the point on national consciousness, I think we really need a Pan-Africanist that's grounded. By this, I mean, when I look at Pan-Africanism and the experience of Pan-Africanism in Africa, we see it in rooms like these. We see it amongst post-colonial intellectuals. We see it maybe in the corridors of the union buildings. We see it in the corridors of the AU. But when I go back to Mabopane, again, let me put that way. When I go back to my home, I don't see Pan-Africanism as a reality. It's not grounded, it hovers over our heads, right? And I think that's why I pose this question of what kind of material conditions, what kind of conditions are required on a much more grounded level to make sure that Pan-Africanism is a reality for everyone. Because I mean, I fear that it's going to continuously become an ideology simply. It's going to continuously become a conversation simply, and not actually be something that is lived on an everyday basis, because I think we are not quite ready yet to start getting our hands dirty, right? And making sure that we really ingrain, or we really like toss the soil to make sure that anybody really in this country, for example, can be a Pan-Africanist without even knowing it as an ideology or the extent of it or the complexities of it that we are going to be discussing today, but can really see that, okay, my reality is not contingent on a hatred of or an exclusion of the other, right? Yeah, so that's as much as I can say on that.
Thank you. And now to open up to the floor. We have about 15 minutes, so please.
Thank you very much for for the floor. There is an African proverb that goes, until the lion learn how to write every story, the story will always glorify the hunter. I think Minister's intervention is a demonstration that the lion has begun to write its story. I did not know that the founders of this democracy that we are enjoying have made such a very powerful contribution to the idea of Pan-Africanism. Now I have a weapon. When I'm accused of being xenophobic as a South African, I have a weapon to refer to say that the founders of this country have contributed to Pan-Africanism. Therefore, you cannot accuse everybody for being xenophobic. I think I'll stop here.
There was a hand, yes. Yes.
I have a question, and I'm going to try to just summarize it. I gave a lecture, I think 2 weeks ago, to some students in Portugal. The role of human rights. Sorry, what was it? The role of Africa. Human rights in Africa. The role of ECOWAS. Human rights in Africa. So, one of the students, it was in the Instituto Universitário de Lisboa. That was where I gave the lectures. And one of the students asked me, and he was like, why is ECOWAS the champion producer of cocoa? If ECOWAS is the champion producer of cocoa, what are we going to say about child labor? So I was like, wow. I tried to merry-go-round, and I gave the student a very good answer. But then my question today is, what is the role of ECOWAS, the AU, the OAU, and other African organizations that foster peace, empowerment, economic growth? What is our role in promoting Pan-Africanism? Because I had the opportunity some years back to also serve with ECOWAS during my national youth service. And I was in the ECOWAS Commission in Abuja, and looking at everything and coming to these, like the whole thing. What is our role? Like, how can we foster this? Because that is my dream. That is my passion. My passion is that Africa, we should be an African that, promotes all these things together. I study in Europe, and I have been all my study has been tackling so many things in Europe, and I find myself here in Africa because of my family, and this is my question. How can we come together? What is that tool, or what is that paradigm that can be implemented that can bring about the growth of this Pan-Africanism we're talking about? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Minister Naledi Pandor, UCT senior team, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gomezulu. Yes, and I have a question. I'm really asking, let's say if Pan-Africanism developed from an ideal into a practical approach. For example, let's say Pan-Africanists have a movement in building and developing oil refinement infrastructure, across the continent of Africa, because since we're in a continent surrounded by an ocean, there's oil refinements all around. So what if, us as Pan-Africanists, we actually have that ideal to actually build something like that? Wouldn't that be a more approachable movement, given everything that's happening since across the world? We have an oil problem, and even here in South Africa we have an oil problem, because if we could generate our own oil, we could have petrol, supply our own petrol, and we could actually do something. Even work would be employ people, So that's just my question. Thank you.
Thanks. And there was another question back there. Well, maybe we'll take this and one more, and then we'll have a round of answers. Thanks.
Okay, so my question, I think it's more towards the second set of panelists. What I was thinking about is, okay, so specifically, I think what I'm thinking about right now is the issue of belonging and the politics that come with belonging. So I think that the issues that were raised in terms of like distributive justice, as Olorado, I think that's what you were communicating about. So in terms of these particular issues where we live like in a very unjust country and also an unjust Africa, essentially, what do you think that that work would look like? Because you mentioned that it would be grounded work that we need to look at. So how do we actually move towards that particular grounded work in spaces where we still have, what can I call it, such injustice and inequality? So is it even possible if you think about it without these particular reforms to the issues with distributive justice that we have in Africa? Also, just quickly to segue into something else which might actually link to that, I'm also thinking about what Professor Chessie was saying. Casey, sorry, was saying in terms of the us versus them situation. So, for example, if we think about, let's say, one thing that I'm thinking about is the travel, like for example, traveling in and around Africa, as for example, a queer man, or traveling in and around Africa as a woman. In that case, is there a way in which you think that we would be able to conscientize people in terms of Pan-Africanism if they don't actually feel safe in the rest of Africa? Because I think that particular, what can I call it? That particular politics of belonging will always, in my mind at least, be pertinent as long as one isn't able to be themselves and whole in other parts of Africa where they are able to be in some others. Of course, I'm not making South Africa the land of milk and honey in terms of like queer rights. I'm just saying that there are particular rights that we find here that you might not be able to find elsewhere. So if somebody is not able to find them elsewhere, is there a way in which they can appreciate Pan-Africanism as something that might impact them? I hope those questions were clear. I think it was two.
And we have one more question here. We'll have a second round. Oh, we had the question here, then we'll have a second round.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Good evening to everyone. My name is Mtawe Langa, and I just have one question. Well, I've had a couple, but most of them have been kind of touched on. I would like to understand, once we do, if we ideally get to a point where Pan-Africanism is an accepted ideology, even at grassroots level, and we're finally able to get on our feet and wanting to use our vast resources and people and educated Africans to actually advance and feed ourselves and feed the rest of the world, how do we find a way or combat the international hindrances from post or colonial countries trying to stop Africa from actually getting that sort of independence? How do we get that independence that we need from colonial forces, and also ensuring that we don't fall into neo-colonialism? Yeah, what is the way forward? How do we combat international hindrances and interference in Africa? Thank you.
We actually won't have time for a second round, so let's ask one last question.
Hello, thank you. My question is actually kind of like leading off of yours a little bit. I wanted to ask, what, if any, role does Pan-Africanism play in liberating the imagination of historically colonized people? Listening to everyone speak here today, I don't know, some of the topics that have been brought up in terms of the steps we advance Africans or even the continent feels like it's sort of trying to emulate Western domination and Western, I don't know, histories, something to that extent. So yeah, that was my question.
Okay, thanks. So answers from the panel, and then we'll wrap up before the lights go out.
Let's start from that side for a change.
Okay, yes. Can you start on your end?
Yeah, so I'll just I'll answer the question around the politics of belonging and what grounded work is required. I mean, it's a very difficult question, I think, to address, because I think as we find ourselves right now, we find ourselves where Pan-Africanism is still is very much in the imagination, or we find ourselves where we've become very comfortable with Pan-Africanism being something to talk at each other as individuals who are probably more inclined to Pan-Africanism and so forth. So I think that on that level, my own self, and I think to just call myself out as a national intellectual or national elite, I've become very comfortable in kind of that space of dialogue, right, and not really going into depth about what kind of reality I would like to see. So in that instance, like, I wish I did have an answer around how to really what needs to be done, what are the steps that need to be done. But I can say this, I can say that we need more effective, stances on issues of, for example, immigration, on issues of how to handle crowds that are angry at or that are hateful in the townships, for example. Not to take these flip-floppy kind of stances to kind of appease, you know, the current heat of the moment, but to stay principled and to even educate the people, to tell them that, look, I understand, but let me show you that, let me try and show you that your reality is not contingent on the rejection of another, right? So ultimately, maybe it goes into education, it goes into awareness, it goes into taking principled stance as individuals who find ourselves embodied in these communities to make sure that Pan-Africanism at least is something that can fall easier on the ears of many.
Yes, thank you very much for your questions. I think that changing people's mindsets, I mean, I look at Gandhi talking about attitudes and mindsets. And also the minister actually referred to this. It's a long process. It doesn't happen overnight. I think that the independence on the continent was a very important moment. The end of apartheid was a very important moment. But the burden of this generation is really about changing attitudes and mindsets. And consciousness, I think, is a collective process. So as an individual, I don't think that it's possible to, you know, wake up one day and suddenly you're free in your mind. It's a collective process. It's something that happens in communities, in groups. And when you spoke about queerness, I think it's something that's often we hear about it as a contradiction to being African, right? A lot of people have said that being queer is un-African. And of course we know that that's not true. But it's about developing that consciousness. It often happens through movements, Roads Must Fall, other social movements. And then I think what's really important is that these movements come and go, right? So then it's not sustainable for these movements to exist forever. And then that's where the role of institutions is important. The movements influence the thinking and processes and bureaucracies of institutions, which also change very slowly, but they do. They change slowly and incrementally. And they're also there to record those changes. Yeah, maybe let me just leave it there. Thanks, Chair.
Maybe let me address the question on ECOWAS. You know, ECOWAS, IGAD, ECAS, the AU, it's not something there. It is us. And we've got to see it in that context. So if I go to Addis Ababa, I'm not going to something called the African Union that is there. I'm going to my organization, which I'm contributing to. And it's not about the chairman of the African Union changing things on the continent. No, it's not it's what I bring as an individual also to the African Union. So we can't talk about the institute, whether you're, if you're in Abuja, you're there at the headquarters, then it's what you contribute. It's all of us, our collective contribution to developing and liberating the continent. And that's the consciousness that we're talking about. How do you build that consciousness? So when you talk about, how do you actually liberate the mind from this colonial legacy? Can we do it? Well, yes, we can do it, because if you look at, it doesn't happen overnight. It's about your lived experience. And but I want to challenge young people today to say, in our generation, we were inspired by Steve Biko and his Black consciousness. He was 30 years old when he was writing these things. And he inspired an entire generation to liberate their minds, to not just liberate their minds, but to take action. We were there on the streets, we were taking action to liberate ourselves from the shackles of apartheid, because we first liberated our minds. And I think that's the challenge. So who will be the Steve Biko of today that will write about African consciousness, not Black consciousness? And if we can change our minds, then we can talk about, it's not about building refineries. It's about beneficiating our endowment, the endowment that we have as a continent. How do we beneficiate that? Because at the end of all of it, the whatever we call it, ideology, philosophy, etc., it's what, when I quoted Amilcar Cabral, it's about changing the lives of ordinary people. And that means at the end of it, is beneficiating the endowment that we have as a continent, and ensuring that we protect it from this neocolonialism that we are talking about. And we're at a very, very dangerous inflection point now. It's extremely dangerous. And the war in Ukraine has sharpened those contradictions for us. And so we have to be very, very careful as a continent now. And so this is a very timely symposium, very timely seminar now. And so we can't leave here today and say this was a seminar. No, because tomorrow we face that challenge of our continent being colonized again. And it's a very real challenge.
No, fine, we invented it, but we perfected it. Then my point was, where does Africa feature in all of that? So I had to write a piece on that one too, because my worry was that Africans were being left out of the discussion. And the point I made was a very simple one, that you cannot talk about international relations and leave Africa out. And then I started citing a number of examples. And then the last example I want to use here is when people started telling lies about relations between the IFP and the ANC, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, where I come from. And people were basically telling lies, saying that the ANC is for Amaxhosa and then the IFP is for Amazulu. I had to correct that myth and say, let us look at the history of the ANC. Who were the founding leaders of the ANC? Who was elected in absentia as the first president of the ANC? Well, was it not Langalbalele Dube? Where did he come from? Then I started listing the likes of Pixley Isaka Seme. When the ANC was in trouble after the apartheid government of D.F. Malan, the role that the Pan-Africanist agenda would assist in liberating us. First of all, when we came up with the AU, we were also influenced by the EU, isn't it? And we're looking at what is it that is good in the EU. We're not going to transport what the EU is doing and then imbibe it like a sponge will do when sucking water. We're going to take what works from the EU and we're going to make something that is tailor-made for Africa. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we look at that which works and then that works for us, and we try to localize it so that at least it makes sense to us. So in this case then, if we were to have a Pan-Africanist idea or liberating idea at this present moment, some of the things we'll be doing will be to draw from the examples that a minister has referred to from the consider our local context, because the context is different. the way the Pan-Africanist agenda was conceived way back then in the 19th and 18th centuries is different from what we are facing today. So the needs of Africa today necessitate that we look at our present circumstances and then try to find ways of dealing with the situation. So basically, the point I make in my notes, which I didn't have time to talk to, is that Pan-Africanism was good then. It is still good now. What has changed is the context. Once we understand that, then we're on the right track. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel for this rich discussion.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, Deputy Vice Chancellor, the Dean, diplomats that are here, ladies and gentlemen. It was quite an interesting seminar that we had. And I think we will all agree that we are beginning to address what is quite a big concern for us, this generation of people, that what's going to happen after us, after we go. Because the agents of Pan-Africanism is either they are getting fewer and fewer, or they are just disappearing from the world. So you hear very much lesser than before on Pan-Africanism. And I think this discussion was quite important because we have to deal with from here, how do we go forward from here? And how do we make it a point that our children also buy into Pan-Africanism and begin to understand that it's an it is a question of our existence. It is not something that we can have option. It's not something that is optional, that you can have option and become. But the success of Africa depends on Pan-Africanism. And it is something that I'm saying it will be said when it does. I was hearing Vasu when he was saying that we had our Steve Biko when we were defining ourselves as young black children of this country or the youth of this country. We had our Steve Biko who was helping us to go through that. And I think I agree with him that we do need a Steve Biko who's going to begin to define for us, because our children, we need to be talking to them about Pan-Africanism and begin to engage about Pan-Africanism, because I think it is something that is quite critical. Now, I just want to give a big thank you to you, Honorable Minister, for making time, and also for having identified the need to host these commemorative events from the month of May until the day of the formation of AU, which was 9th of July 2002 in Durban. The planned events include the public lecture that took place yesterday titled Africa in 2063, Removing Obstacles to Prosperity. This evening public seminar under the theme Pan-Africanism in Current Times, culminating to a commemorative celebration to be hosted in Durban in July 2022, marking the 20 years since the formation of the AU or betrayed. I think that is what we want to be saying about our children. How are we going to help our children to discover their mission and fulfill it without betraying it? A prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development, an integrated continent, politically united based on the ideals of Pan-Africanism and the vision of Africa's renaissance. An Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law, a peaceful and secure Africa, an Africa with a strong cultural identity, common heritage, shared values and ethics, an Africa whose development is people-driven, relying on the potential of African people, especially its women and youth, and caring for children. Africa as a strong, united, resilient, and influential global player and partner. The University of Cape Town and the Faculty of Humanities were told will host a series of events, including the public lecture of yesterday and today's as a seminar to celebrate Africa Month. We are indeed grateful that the university is hosting these events and is playing its rightful role in the discourse to shape the narrative about where we come from, where we are, and where we want to be. It is therefore fitting that we must give special thanks to the University of Cape Town, represented here by the Deputy Vice Chancellor, for the vision and leadership you provide in this collective effort of building Africa we want by 2063. Thank you very much, UCT, for all the work that you've done. We are indeed very grateful to the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Associate Professor Casey, whom we have worked with very closely right from the beginning and when we were conceptualizing this idea of what we had to do, and she was so much keen to have us to come to UCT and assured us that UCT will not disappoint. And actually, her mere appearance said that, because this was the first time I saw a young woman being a dean of such a huge faculty. I'd never seen it before. It was a big, pleasant surprise. We thank you very much, Dean, for your collaboration and leadership. Special thanks once more to the Deputy Vice Chancellor for so ably chairing this important seminar. A big thank you to the panelists, Professor Casey again, Professor Gomezulu. It was worth the effort, Professor Gomezulu, to get you from KZN to break whatever you were doing and come here. Thank you for agreeing to come. You know, he was busy with his work in KZN, and we had to ask him to come, and here he is. Vasu Gounden, I don't know whether to thank you because you were always part of this team. We've always worked together with Vasu on all these Pan-Africanist issues. He's always been there from the beginning, and I'm glad really that you are still keeping the faith. And Mr. Olerato Mukhomu, thank you. Thank you. And you're some of the interesting ideas that you came up with and the challenges that we are facing. You know, the question of how do we relate to the visitors that came out, but that came from other countries. But where I would not agree with you when you say they liberated us, we liberated ourselves. We fought for this country. We died for this country. We're imprisoned. Our bodies were broken for this country. Nobody liberated us. Always remember that we liberated ourselves. They supported us. They gave us all the support we required, but they didn't give us liberation. We grabbed the liberation. We took it ourselves. I think I needed to make that. And and you, Dr. Tuto Tipe, thank you very much for moderating this seminar so well and so excellently. I really think that the minister has not yet given me that instruction, but I think she's going to give me that instruction, and I know she's going to say it, that this is just the beginning, that it's a relationship that we want to keep and we must work on. And I think the more we work with our young minds and the academics, the more we have chances of getting Pan-Africanist ideas still very, very much relevant and in place. So I think I'm going to get that instruction. I can feel it in my And I also saw some diplomats here in the hall, and I want to say thank you, diplomats and the students that are here, guests and participants, for gracing this very important event to mark Africa Month with your presence. We know very well that the attainment of Africa we want in 2063 requires all of us to act together in unity for a common goal. Ladies and gentlemen, such an event cannot happen overnight. It requires planning and hard work. We have been fortunate enough to be supported by a team of very motivated and dedicated colleagues from the University of Cape Town. A number of them are here. I saw, they've been very, 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 very helpful. I actually even wondered how the dean managed to make them to want to do this, because they didn't seem like they were looking for a payment for their overtime. They looked like they are just doing this because they like it. And also colleagues from the DERCO, Department of International Relations and Cooperation, who have been with this from the beginning, and thank you very much. And thank you very much to all the people who work behind the scenes to ensure the success of this event. Thank you very much. So as I said, I'm waiting for the instruction. I'm sure we will come back here very soon. Thank you.